The laughing started in the corner booth, the way cruelty in a small town always does, young, loud, and certain nobody was going to stop it. An old cowboy sat alone at the counter of the Blue Sage Diner, just off the highway outside Kingman, Arizona, on a hot afternoon in the summer of 1962. He had a cup of black coffee in front of him and a hat set crown down on the stool beside him, and he was minding his own business the way he'd minded it for 80 years. His name was Wesley Cade. He was 79 years old. His hands were knotted and brown as saddle leather, and they shook a little now when he lifted the cup, and 3 teenage boys in the corner booth had decided that made him funny. Remember that. An old man drinking his coffee, bothering nobody, and 3 boys decided he was there for their entertainment. Nobody in that diner knew that the tall man who had just come in out of the heat and taken a booth by the window without a word had already seen everything. Nobody knew that before the afternoon was over, that stranger would rise, cross the black and white tile floor, and say a few quiet words that would drain the color right out of 3 young faces. And nobody, not the boys, not the waitress, not the old cowboy himself, knew the sentence that was about to travel around that diner in a whisper. 6 words, passed from the cook to the waitress to the man at the register. 6 words that would change how every soul in that room looked at the shaking old man at the counter for the rest of their lives. That's John Wayne's old ranch foreman. There's a thing about an old man who's lived a hard and honest life. He wears it quiet. He doesn't announce it. And the young, who mistake quiet for weakness, sometimes learn the hardest lesson of their lives, finding out the difference. They didn't know a legend's own foreman was sitting at that counter, but they were about to learn something they'd carry the rest of their days. That you never can tell, just by looking, what a quiet old man has done, or who might come through the door to stand beside him. This is the story of the afternoon the laughing stopped. To understand why that afternoon mattered, you have to understand Wesley Cade. And nobody in that diner ever bothered. He'd been born in 1883 in the back of a wagon, before Arizona was even a state. He'd grown up in the saddle. By the time he was 15, he was riding fence and breaking horses. By 20, he was running cattle drives up through the high country, when there were still men alive who remembered the open range. He'd buried 2 brothers, 1 wife, and more good horses than he could count. His body was a map of 80 years of hard country, a shoulder that had been broken by a fall and never set right, a limp from a longhorn that caught him in 31, and hands so knotted from rope and rain and cold mornings that they'd stopped fully closing years ago. For most of his working life, Wesley Cade had been a foreman. A foreman is the man who runs a ranch when the owner can't, the man who hires and fires, who reads the weather and the cattle and the men, who's first up in the morning and last to bed at night, who carries the whole outfit on his shoulders and takes the blame when things go wrong and hands the credit to others when things go right. There was a thing Wesley Cade used to say to the young hands, back in his ranching days, that the ones who stayed with the work never forgot. He'd say, "Any fool can be the loudest man at the fire. It takes a real one to be the man the outfit can't run without, and never once mention it." He lived that. He believed a man's worth wasn't in what he told you about himself, but in what got done quietly while nobody was watching. He believed the measure of a man was how he treated the horse that couldn't buck him off anymore, and the hand who was too old to earn his keep, and the stranger who could do nothing for him in return. That was Wesley Cade's whole religion, and he'd never once preached it. He'd just lived it, every cold morning of 80 hard years. And for 11 years, in the 1930s and into the 40s, Wesley Cade had been the foreman of a working cattle ranch in Arizona, owned by a young actor who was just then becoming the most famous man in America. Cade never talked about it. That was the thing. He'd worked for the man for 11 years, ridden with him, eaten at the same fire, pulled him out of more than one scrape with a green horse, taught him half of what he knew about handling cattle and rope and the country itself. And in all the years since, Wesley Cade had never once used that name to make himself seem like somebody. Not to get a free drink, not to impress a stranger, not even to comfort himself. He carried it the way he carried everything, quiet. By 1962, the ranch was long behind him. His wife was in the ground. His body had finally quit on him for good work, and he lived on almost nothing in a little rented place at the edge of Kingman, and he drove into town twice a week for coffee and the company of strangers, because a man who spent his whole life around other men can't stand a silent house. That was all anybody in the Blue Sage saw when he came in. A broke, shaking old man in a worn shirt, taking up a stool and nursing a nickel cup of coffee. And because that was all they thought he was, 3 boys in the corner booth felt free to make sport of him. Here is how cruelty works among the young. It needs a ringleader, and it needs a crowd that won't say no. The ringleader was a big kid named Chad Merrick, 17, the son of a man who owned 2 gas stations and had never once told his boy he couldn't have a thing he wanted. Chad had the kind of confidence that comes not from having done anything hard, but from never having been made to answer for anything. He had 2 friends with him in the booth, boys who laughed when he laughed, because it was easier than not. It started small. Chad noticed the old man's hands shaking as he lifted his coffee, and he made a joke about it, loud enough to carry. "Hey," he said to his friends, "look at Grandpa over there. He's going to spill it before he gets it to his mouth. $5 says he dumps the whole thing in his lap." The 2 friends laughed. Wesley Cade heard it. Of course he heard it. The diner wasn't big. But he'd heard a great many things in 79 years, and he'd learned long ago that most cruelty runs out of gas if you don't feed it. So he set the cup down carefully, and he said nothing, and he looked out the window at the highway shimmering in the heat. But not feeding it this time only made it hungrier. Chad slid out of the booth and sauntered over, and he leaned on the counter next to the old man, grinning. "Hey, old-timer, you a real cowboy? You look like one of them dried-up things they hang on the wall for decoration." His friends snickered. "What are you, 100? You even remember your own name?" "My name's Cade," the old man said quietly, "and I'd take it kindly if you left me to my coffee, son." "Son," Chad repeated, and rolled his eyes at his friends. "You hear that? He called me son." He picked up the old man's hat from the stool, the good felt hat, shaped and worn by 50 years of Arizona sun, and he set it on his own head at a stupid angle and pranced a little. "Look at me. I'm a big, tough cowboy. I'm going to go rope me a cactus." The friends howled. "Give me back my hat, son," Wesley Cade said. His voice hadn't risen, but something had come into it now, low and level, that a wiser boy would have heard. Chad didn't hear it. He sailed the hat down the counter like a frisbee, where it knocked over a sugar dispenser and landed on the floor by the register. And then, and this was the part the whole diner would remember with shame, he reached out and jostled the old man's elbow, hard, so the coffee sloshed up over the rim and spilled down the front of Wesley Cade's clean shirt. "Whoops," Chad said, grinning. "Told you he'd spill it." The waitress, a young woman named Faye, started forward with her mouth open to say something, and lost her nerve, because Chad Merrick's father owned 2 gas stations, and her own father worked at one of them. There were maybe 8 other people in the Blue Sage that afternoon, a trucker at the far end of the counter, a young mother with a toddler in a booth, an old couple sharing a slice of pie, and every one of them saw it happen, and every one of them looked down at their plates, because that is the terrible arithmetic of cruelty in a small town. Everyone hopes someone else will be the one to stand up, and so no one does. And old Wesley Cade sat there with coffee soaking into his shirt, 79 years old, humiliated in front of a room full of people, and he did the hardest thing a proud man can do. He kept his temper. He reached for a napkin with a hand that shook worse now, and he began, slowly, to blot at his shirt, and he said nothing at all. But a man who was watching close, and one man in that diner was watching very close indeed, would have seen the old cowboy's jaw set and his shoulders square just slightly under that worn shirt, the way a man's do when he's reminding himself he has survived far worse than this, and will survive this too. That was the moment, that exact moment, with an old man quietly cleaning up a mess that wasn't his fault, when a chair scraped back by the window, and a very tall man stood up. Before we go on, let me ask you something, and I want you to answer it honestly, in your own heart. Have you ever watched someone weak get picked on by someone strong, and felt that hot, sick feeling in your gut, and still said nothing? Have you ever stood by while an old person, a person who couldn't fight back, got treated like they didn't matter? Most of us have. And most of us wish, looking back, that we'd been the one to stand up. If this story is stirring something in you, do me a small kindness. Type the word respect in the comments below, so we know there are still folks out there who believe our elders ought to be honored, not humiliated. And if you believe the strong should protect the weak instead of prey on them, subscribe and stay with us, because what happens in the next few minutes is the reason this story has been told for 60 years. Now, back to the tall man standing up by the window. He was a big man. That was the first thing everyone in the diner noticed at once. He had come in maybe 10 minutes before, ordered nothing but a cup of coffee and a slice of pie, and settled into the booth by the window with his hat pulled low, and nobody had paid him much mind. Just a big fellow passing through on the highway, resting out of the heat. Now he stood, and he seemed to fill the whole diner. He set his hat on the table. He crossed the black and white tile floor without any hurry at all, the slow, easy walk of a man who has never once in his life needed to rush to be taken seriously. He bent down by the register, picked up Wesley Cade's good felt hat off the floor, and dusted it off against his leg, careful, the way you'd handle something that mattered. Then he came up to the counter, and he set the hat down gently beside the old man, and he turned to face the three boys. "Son," he said to Chad Merrick, and his voice was low and slow, and it carried into every corner of that room. "You just did something you're going to spend the rest of your life wishing you could take back, and I'm going to give you one chance to make it right before I lose my patience, and you do not want me to lose my patience." Chad Merrick opened his mouth to say something smart, but there was something in the way the big man stood there, patient, immovable, like a mountain that had decided to walk over and have a word with you, that made the boy close it again. All three of them had gone quiet. "That hat you were throwing around," the stranger said, "is worth more than everything you own, boy. Not the felt, the head it belongs to. You threw a lifetime on the floor like it was trash because you were too young and too soft to know what you were looking at." And it was right then, in the hush that had fallen over the diner, that the whisper started. It came from the cook, a wiry old man named Hector, who'd been standing at the pass-through with a plate in his hand, frozen, staring at the man at the counter. Hector leaned toward Faye, the waitress, and he said something low and urgent, and her eyes went wide. And Faye turned and said it to the man at the register, and it went around that diner like a spark down a fuse, table to table, in a whisper that got louder each time it was passed. "That's Wesley Cade. That's John Wayne's old foreman. He ran the Duke's ranch, 11 years. That's the Duke's own foreman those boys just spilled coffee on." Let me stop here, because I think this is the part of the story that matters most, and I don't want it to rush past you. Have you ever been judged by how you looked on your worst, tiredest, poorest day, and had someone decide that was the whole of who you were? Have you ever done great work in your life, quietly, and asked no credit for it, and then grown old and watched the world look right through you as if you'd never mattered at all? Have you ever hoped, really hoped, that someday, somehow, someone would come along who knew what you were really worth? Wesley Cade had lived 79 years and asked the world for almost nothing. And on a hot afternoon in a highway diner, in front of the very boys who'd humiliated him, the world was about to find out exactly who he was. They don't make many men like the one who stood up in that diner, but they made a few, and this is why we still tell their stories. Stay with me, it gets better. The whisper reached Chad Merrick's ears at last, and the big kid's grin fell right off his face. "Wait," he said. "John Wayne? The actor? That's not—" He looked at the shaking old man in the coffee-stained shirt and back at the tall stranger, and something cold began to crawl up the back of his neck. "How do you know that? How does anybody know that?" The big man didn't answer him straight off. Instead, he pulled out the stool on the other side of Wesley Cade and eased himself down onto it. And he looked at the old cowboy for a long moment. And when he spoke, it was to Cade alone, as if the rest of the diner had melted clean away. "You don't recognize me, do you, Wes?" the stranger said quietly. It wasn't a question. Wesley Cade turned and looked at him, really looked, squinting through eyes that had gone dim with the years. And then those old eyes went wide, and his knotted hands began to shake worse than before, and his mouth worked a moment before any sound came out. "I'll be," Cade whispered. "I'll be a son of a gun. It's you. After all these years, it's really you." "It's me," the big man said, and he laid one of his big hands over the old man's shaking ones, gentle as anything. 20 years, Wes. Been trying to find you for 2 of them, ever since I came back through this country and heard the old outfit had scattered." He turned then, at last, to the 3 boys and to the whole diner listening. "Let me tell you who this man is," the stranger said, "because you spilled his coffee and you threw his hat on the floor, and not one of you is worthy to sit at the same counter as him. When I was a young man," he said, "still green, still learning, before the whole world knew my face, I ran cattle on a ranch in this state, and I didn't know the first real thing about it. I could sit a horse for a camera, but I couldn't have read a sky or handled a spooked herd to save my life. And the man they put in charge of teaching me, the foreman who ran that whole outfit, who was up before me every morning and abed after me every night, who never once let me look the fool in front of the hands, was Wesley Cade." He tightened his grip a little on the old man's hands. "This man pulled me out from under a horse that would have crushed my chest one cold morning in 1934, the stranger said, grabbed my collar and hauled me clear with about half a second to spare, and then chewed me out for a fool for the next 20 minutes so I'd never do it again. This man taught me how to throw a rope, how to read weather off the mountains, how to talk to men so they'd follow you instead of fear you. Half of what folks think they admire about me, half of it, I learned off this shaking old man you thought was so funny." He paused, and his eyes had gone somewhere far off, back across the years. "There was a night," he went on, quieter now. "A storm came down out of the mountains and scattered the whole herd, and we rode till dawn in the rain and the dark, bringing them back. And I was cold and scared and ready to quit, and I said something bitter, said the cattle weren't worth a man's neck. And Wes here reined up beside me in that driving rain, and he said, 'Son, it was never about the cattle. It's about whether you're the kind of man who finishes what he starts when it's easy to quit. The herd's just how we find out.'" The big man's voice thickened. "I have thought about that sentence every hard day of my life since. Every one. And I'll bet you a year's wages he doesn't even remember saying it. That's how you can tell a great man from a loud one. The great one hands you something that changes your whole life, and then forgets he ever did it." The diner was dead silent now. You could hear the coffee percolating behind the counter. "And in 11 years, the stranger said, and in all the 20 years since, this man never once used my name to make himself bigger, never sold a story about me to a magazine, never bragged in a bar that he'd taught the dupe to ride. He just did his work, and did it right, and let me take the shine for it. And that, boys," he looked hard at Chad Merrick, "that is what a real man looks like. Not the loud one, the quiet one, the one you just poured coffee on." You could have heard a napkin drop in that diner. Chad Merrick's 2 friends had gone grey. The waitress, Faye, had a hand pressed over her mouth, and Chad himself stood frozen by the counter, 17 years old, and, for the first time in his soft life, understanding all the way down to his boots that he had done something he could not undo. But the stranger wasn't finished, because there was a thing nobody in that diner knew, not even Wesley Cade. "There's more, Wes," the big man said, rising up off the stool to his full height. "When I heard you'd scattered with the old outfit, I made some calls. Took my people the better part of 2 years to run you down, and what they told me broke my heart clean in half." He looked around the diner. "This man, who taught me my whole trade, who saved my fool life, has been living at the edge of this town on almost nothing. Cold in the winter, a busted truck. Twice a week he drives into town for a nickel cup of coffee, not because he's thirsty, but because he can't stand the silence of an empty house." He shook his head slowly. "That is not going to be true one more day," he said. "Wes, there's a good little place out past the fairgrounds, house, barn, a few acres, a couple of gentle horses for a man to look at out his window. I bought it this morning. It's yours, free and clear, deed in your name, for the rest of your life. And there's an account at the bank that'll keep your truck running, and your belly full, and your winters warm, and you'll never spend another cold night as long as you live." He held up a hand before the old man could protest. "It's not charity, Wes. Don't you dare call it charity. It's a wage. It's 20 years of back wages for a foreman who was never once paid what he was worth." Wesley Cade tried to speak, and couldn't. His eyes had filled, and the tears ran down into the deep brown creases of his face, and he shook his head slowly, not refusing, just overcome, the way a proud man is overcome when the world finally, after too long, does him right. Then the stranger turned to the three boys, and he did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. "You humiliated this man because he was old and poor, and his hands shook," the stranger said. "Let me tell you what those shaking hands did. Those hands broke 1,000 horses. Those hands pulled men out from under danger. Those hands roped and doctored and worked from before sunup to after dark for 50 years, so that other men, softer men, luckier men, men like your fathers and like me, could sleep safe and eat beef and live easy. Those hands are shaking because they wore themselves out doing honest work, and you laughed at them." He let that sit. "I hope you live long enough to be ashamed of it, and I hope you live long enough to be half the man he is. You've got a long, long way to go." It was Faye the waitress who finally said it out loud, because everybody in the diner was already thinking it, and nobody had the nerve. "You're him," she said softly. "You're really him. You're John Wayne." The big man reached for his hat off the booth table and settled it on his head, and he didn't confirm it, and he didn't deny it. He just put one steadying hand under Wesley Cade's arm and helped the old cowboy up off the stool, slow and careful, and handed him his good felt hat. "What matters," he said to the room, "isn't who I am. It's who he is. You remember that. Long after you've forgotten my face, you remember there was a man named Wesley Cade who came through this town, and you treated him poorly, and you were wrong." He walked the old man toward the door, matching his slow, hitching pace. But he stopped before they got there, and he turned back, and he looked once more at Chad Merrick, the boy standing hollow and ashamed by the counter. "Son," the stranger said, and his voice had lost the hard edge now and gone almost gentle, "I'm not going to lay a hand on you. A man doesn't hit a boy to teach him a lesson. That's just making a bigger bully. But I'll tell you what you're going to do. You're going to walk over to that man, and you're going to look him in the eye, and you're going to tell him you're sorry, and you're going to mean it. Because how you treat a man who can't do a thing for you, that's the whole measure of you. That's all you'll ever be. Now go on." And Chad Merrick, 17 years old, his whole soft certainty knocked clean out of him, walked across that diner on shaking legs and stood in front of Wesley Cade and said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "I'm sorry, sir. I'm real sorry. I didn't know." And old Wesley Cade, who had every right in the world to be bitter, looked at the boy a long moment, and then he reached out one knotted, shaking hand and put it on the boy's shoulder. "I know you didn't, son," Cade said. "That's the whole trouble with the young. You can't see what's standing right in front of you. But you're seeing it now. And a man who learns to see it while he's still young enough to change, well, he might turn out all right after all." And then the tall man and the old cowboy walked out of the Blue Sage diner together into the hot Arizona afternoon, and the screen door banged shut behind them, and the whole diner sat in a silence so deep you could hear the highway humming. Nobody laughed. Not that afternoon. Not ever again about the shaking old man at the counter. Wesley Cade lived 7 more years, and they were gentle ones. He got his little place past the fairgrounds, with the barn and the few acres and the 2 gentle horses he could watch out his kitchen window of a morning. He never wanted for anything again. But more than the house, more than the warm winters, he had something he'd gone without for 20 years. He had folks who knew what he was worth. The town changed the way it saw him. Once the story got around Kingman, and in a town that size, it got around by supper, people who'd looked right through Wesley Cade for years began to tip their hats to him on the street. The Blue Sage diner would never take his money again. Every cup of coffee, every plate, was on the house until the day he died, and Faye the waitress made sure of it personally. Old-timers who'd worked cattle in their own younger days started coming out to his place on Sunday afternoons to sit on his porch and swap stories, and the empty silence Wesley Cade had dreaded for so long was gone for good. And Chad Merrick came back. 2 weeks after that afternoon in the diner, the boy drove out to the little ranch past the fairgrounds, alone, and knocked on the door, and asked Wesley Cade if there was any work he could do. For free, he said, just to make it right. And Cade, who never held a grudge in his life, put the boy to work mending fence and mucking the barn, and learning, slow, how to sit a horse the right way. That first Saturday, Chad got thrown twice and stepped on once, And each time the old man just watched from the fence rail and said, "Get up. A horse can smell a quitter, and so can everybody else. Get up." By noon the boy's hands were raw and his pride was in tatters, and Wesley Cade poured him a cup of coffee from a thermos and said, not unkindly, "You spilled mine 2 weeks ago. Now you've earned one of your own." And something in the boy came loose, and he had to turn away so the old man wouldn't see his face. Chad Merrick spent every Saturday of the next 7 years out at that ranch. He grew up into a steady, decent man, the kind who tips his hat to old-timers and steps in when the strong pick on the weak. And he said, all his life, that everything worth anything about him he'd learned from the old cowboy whose coffee he once spilled. When Chad was a grown man with sons of his own, he brought those boys out to visit Wesley Cade's grave every year and told them the story of the afternoon in the diner, so they'd know that the measure of a man is how he treats the one who can do nothing for him. Every so often, right around the anniversary of that afternoon, a long, dark car would roll up the dirt drive past the fairgrounds, and word would go quiet around Kingman, "He's come to see Wes." And the two of them would sit on the porch in the evening light, the tall man and the old foreman, and talk about horses and weather and men long dead, until the light went out of the Arizona sky. Nobody ever bothered them, and nobody ever sold the story, and the whole town took a quiet pride in guarding the secret of who came, once a year, to sit on an old cowboy's porch. When Wesley Cade died in the summer of 1969, they found among his few belongings a small cedar box. Inside was a photograph of a young ranch hand and his foreman standing by a corral in 1934, a length of worn braided rope Cade had kept all those years, and one thing more, a letter written on plain paper in a big, bold hand. That letter hangs today behind glass in a small ranching museum in northern Arizona, beside a faded photograph of 2 men at a corral and a coil of old braided rope. The placard beneath it names Wesley Cade, cattle foreman, and tells the story of the young man he taught and the greatness he spent his life quietly giving away. It does not name the man who wrote the letter. He asked, right up to the end, that his name be kept off it. But folks who lean in close to the glass can read the letter for themselves. And it says this: "To the man who taught me everything the cameras couldn't. You pulled me out from under that horse and never let me thank you for it. And you taught me my whole trade and let me take the credit. And you never once said a word. You told me one rainy night that it was never about the cattle. It was about whether I'd finish what I started when it was easy to quit. I have tried to be that man every day since. The world thinks it learned what a man ought to be from watching me. But I learned it from watching you. Your friend, always, Marion. And the ones who know their history, the ones who remember that a certain famous man was born Marion Robert Morrison, before the whole world came to know him by another name, those folks step back from the glass a little slower than they stepped up to it. Because they understand then exactly who came through that diner door in 1962. And they understand that the biggest man in America crossed a room to stand beside the smallest, and named the debt he owed, and paid it in full, and asked for nothing in return but the chance to honor the man who'd made him. They humiliated an old cowboy whose hands shook over his coffee, and then someone whispered 6 words. That's John Wayne's old foreman, and a whole diner learned the thing the young are always slowest to learn, that you can never tell, just by looking, what a quiet old man has carried, or what he's given, or who might walk through the door to stand at his side. They don't make men like that anymore, but they made a few, and as long as we tell their stories, they're never really gone.